According to the official records in Richmond, Virginia, Governor's wife Catherine Fairmont died of natural causes in November 1847. Yet sealed documents, hidden in the state archives for over a century, reveal a different story. A story involving 5 enslaved men housed in separate quarters beneath the mansion, connected by underground passages, a series of unexplained pregnancies among the household staff, and a fire that consumed an entire wing of the estate mere hours after Catherine's body was found. The Virginia General Assembly convened for 3 emergency closed-door sessions in the weeks after her death, with every attending member signing a confidentiality agreement not due to expire until 1947. Their discussions were never officially disclosed, but the personal diaries of 7 legislators, discovered separately over decades, all reference the same mysterious phrase, the arrangement in the East Wing. Before we continue with the story of Catherine Fairmont and the secrets buried with her, please take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and leave a comment telling us which state you're listening from. Because what occurred in Virginia could have happened anywhere that power, isolation, and silence converged. What those legislators knew, and what the Fairmont family spent decades trying to erase, begins not with scandal, but with ambition and a young woman whose childhood forged the monster she would become. Catherine Henley was born in Richmond in 1812, the 3rd daughter of tobacco merchant Edmund Henley, whose family had built wealth and influence over 5 Virginia generations. The Henley mansion on Gray Street was among Richmond's finest, filled with imported English furniture, French crystal chandeliers, and maintained by 43 enslaved people with invisible efficiency. Catherine's childhood was one of privilege, yet also of smothering expectation. Her 2 older sisters married well, one to a congressman, another to a plantation owner with holdings across 3 counties. Catherine was expected to follow suit, to be beautiful, accomplished, obedient, and silent. She learned the pianoforte, embroidery, French, and household management. She attended Richmond's finest finishing school, where young ladies were taught their purpose was to be ornaments to future husbands, to produce heirs, and to never express a substantive opinion. But Catherine was unlike her sisters. She was intelligent, curious, and bitterly resented the cage society built for her. She read books deemed unsuitable for young ladies, philosophy, history, political theory. She eavesdropped at doors when her father entertained politicians and businessmen, absorbing conversations about power, money, and influence. And she watched with growing fascination and horror the absolute power white people held over the enslaved in her household. She was 12 when she first grasped what that power meant. A housemaid named Rose, only a few years older than Catherine, was caught stealing food from the kitchen. The punishment was swift and brutal. Rose was stripped to the waist and whipped in the courtyard while the entire household staff was forced to watch. Catherine watched from her bedroom window, hidden behind a curtain, and felt something shift within her. It wasn't horror at the violence, though she knew she should feel that, but something else entirely, a dark, thrilling realization that some could inflict pain, and others had no choice but to endure it. She began to experiment with that power in small ways. She would give orders to the enslaved children working in the house, observing how far she could push them before fear or resentment showed. She would report minor infractions to her mother, knowing punishment would follow. She would create situations where enslaved people failed tasks, then watch as they were disciplined. Her mother noticed and approved. "You have a firm hand," she told Catherine. "That will serve you well when you manage your own household." Her father noticed too, but with less approval. There was a coldness, a calculation in Catherine's eyes when she exercised power that disturbed him. But he said nothing. Girls were their mother's responsibility, and besides, a strong will could be useful in a wife if properly directed. Catherine grew into a beautiful young woman with auburn hair that shone like copper, green eyes that could appear warm or cold, and a figure that drew admiring glances from Richmond's young men. She was accomplished, charming, perfectly trained in the art of being what men wished to see. But beneath the surface, Catherine seethed with rage at the limitations placed upon her. She watched her father make business decisions and her brothers-in-law wield political influence, knowing she was smarter than most of them. Yet she would never be allowed to own property in her own name, to vote, to have any legal existence separate from her father or a future husband. In the eyes of the law, she was barely more than property herself, valuable, but property nonetheless. The only power she would ever hold was over those beneath her in the social hierarchy, and she intended to use it. Thomas Fairmont entered her life in 1830 when Catherine was 18. He was 32, a widower whose first wife and child had died in childbirth. He was handsome in a stern way, educated, ambitious, and sought a wife to help him navigate Richmond society as he built his political career. Catherine's father saw an excellent match. Fairmont owned a profitable plantation, had connections throughout Virginia, and was clearly destined for political success. Catherine saw an opportunity. She set out to make Thomas Fairmont fall in love with her, or at least believe he had. She was charming, attentive, careful to appear just intelligent enough to be interesting, but not so intelligent as to be threatening. She laughed at his jokes, asked thoughtful questions about his political ambitions, and presented herself as the perfect political wife, beautiful, accomplished, and utterly devoted to supporting his career. They married in June 1831 at St. John's Episcopal Church in a ceremony attended by everyone who mattered in Richmond society. Catherine was 19 and believed marriage would grant her the power and independence she craved. She was wrong. Thomas Fairmont was not a cruel husband by the standards of his time. He provided well, gave her a generous household allowance, and treated her with the distant courtesy considered appropriate for spouses of their class. But he also made clear she was to have no involvement in his business or political affairs. Her role was to manage the household and produce heirs, and he expected obedience and unquestioning compliance. Catherine found herself in a new cage, gilded and comfortable, but a cage nonetheless. She had traded her father's authority for her husband's and gained nothing. The first years of marriage were marked by disappointment and growing resentment. Catherine did not become pregnant despite Thomas's regular, dutiful, and brief visits to her bedroom focused solely on producing an heir. Doctors examined her, poked and prodded, and declared no obvious reason for her failure to conceive. The implication was clear: the fault was hers. She was failing in her primary duty as a wife. Thomas never said anything directly, but Catherine saw the disappointment in his eyes and heard the whispers at social gatherings. A childless wife was a failure, and Catherine had spent her life being told failure was unacceptable. She began to withdraw from society, spending more time alone at the Fairmont Plantation House in Hanover County. Thomas was often in Richmond attending to business and politics, leaving Catherine to manage the household and the plantation's enslaved workforce. It was during this isolation that Catherine began developing what would later be called the arrangement. The Fairmont plantation had over 100 enslaved people working the tobacco fields, maintaining the grounds, and running the household. As mistress, Catherine held absolute authority over all of them. She could order anything, punish for any reason or none, and no one would question her. She began exercising that power in increasingly disturbing ways. She would summon enslaved men to her sitting room and order them to stand for hours while she read or did needlework, watching them struggle to remain still, to hide discomfort. She would create impossible tasks, order a room cleaned to perfection, then find fault with invisible specks of dust and order it cleaned again. She would pit enslaved people against each other, rewarding one and punishing another for the same behavior, watching them scramble to please her and avoid her displeasure. The enslaved people on the Fairmont plantation learned to fear Catherine differently than they feared the overseers or even Thomas Fairmont. Overseers were brutal but predictable. If you worked hard and followed rules, you could usually avoid the worst punishments. Thomas was distant and largely indifferent as long as the plantation ran smoothly and profitably. But Catherine was capricious, creative in her cruelty, and seemed to take genuine pleasure in wielding power. She would smile while ordering punishments, speak in a soft, sweet voice while describing exactly how a transgression would be addressed. The enslaved people whispered that something was wrong with her, something broken inside that made her enjoy their suffering. In 1838, Thomas Fairmont was elected governor of Virginia. He and Catherine moved to the governor's mansion in Richmond, a three-story brick structure on Capitol Square that had housed Virginia's chief executive since 1813. Catherine was now First Lady of Virginia, with access to power and influence she had never known. But she quickly discovered even this elevated position came with constraints. She was expected to host teas, attend charity events, smile at political dinners, and be the perfect ornament to her husband's career. She had no real power, no real authority, just a more elaborate cage. The governor's mansion employed a staff of 32 enslaved people, and Catherine immediately asserted control. She reorganized the household, changed schedules, and demanded absolute obedience and perfection. The staff, most of whom had worked in the mansion for years under previous governors, found themselves walking on eggshells, never sure what would displease the new mistress. But Catherine wanted more than a well-run household. She wanted something entirely her own, a space of absolute control, where she could exercise power without oversight or interference. In the spring of 1840, she conceived of the arrangement. The East Wing housed Catherine's private apartments, a bedroom, sitting room, small library, and dressing room. The rooms were spacious, with high ceilings, large windows, and fireplaces. Directly beneath was a basement section used for storage. Catherine saw possibility. She told Thomas she wanted to renovate the basement beneath her apartments to create proper quarters for personal servants. It wasn't an unusual request. Wealthy women often had enslaved people who worked exclusively for them. Thomas, busy with legislative sessions and political crises, approved the renovation without much thought, giving Catherine a budget and telling her to handle it. Catherine hired workers from outside Richmond who wouldn't gossip about her unusual specifications. She wanted the basement divided into 5 separate rooms, each with a door locking from the outside. Each room was to have an actual bed, not just a pallet, plus a small table, chair, and lamp. She wanted a small kitchen area with a stove and food storage. And she wanted a separate staircase built connecting the basement directly to her private sitting room, allowing access without going through the main house. The workers thought it odd but were paid well and knew not to ask questions of wealthy clients. They completed the renovation in 6 weeks. Catherine inspected every detail personally, ensuring everything was exactly as specified. Then she went to the Fairmont plantation in Hanover County and selected 5 men from the enslaved workforce. She chose carefully. She didn't want field hands too rough or uneducated. She wanted men trained for household work, who could read and write, intelligent enough to understand what was expected and desperate enough to comply. Marcus, 28, a skilled carpenter who had built furniture for the plantation house. He was tall and strong with careful hands and a quiet demeanor. He had a wife and 2 children on the plantation and lived in constant fear they would be sold away. James, 26, light-skinned enough that rumors circulated about his parentage. He had worked in the plantation house since boyhood, serving meals and maintaining rooms. He could read and write, skills that made him valuable but also dangerous, as literate slaves were always watched more carefully. William, 30, a blacksmith trained by his father. He was powerfully built, with arms like tree trunks from years at the forge. He had tried to run away once when younger, was caught and whipped so severely he still bore scars across his back. The experience had broken something in him, and he had been docile ever since, moving with the mechanical obedience of a man who had given up hope. Daniel, 24, the youngest. He had been taught to read and write by a previous owner who believed in improving his slaves. He was intelligent, curious, and still had enough spirit to feel anger, though he hid it behind a mask of compliance. Samuel, 29, trained as a personal valet. He knew how to care for fine clothing, shave a man without nicking skin, move through a room unnoticed. He had the invisible quality prized in personal servants. Catherine had each man brought to her sitting room at the plantation one at a time. "You're being transferred to Richmond," she told them. "You'll work in the governor's mansion in my private quarters. You'll have your own rooms, good food, light work. But you must understand you belong to me completely. You will do exactly as I say, When I say it, without question. If you obey, you'll be treated well. If you disobey, or if you ever speak to anyone about what happens in the East Wing, you'll be sold to the Deep South, to the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where slaves last an average of 7 years before they work themselves to death. Do you understand? Each man understood. They had no choice. In their world, enslaved people had no rights, no recourse, no way to refuse an order from their owner. They could only obey and hope to survive. In May 1840, the 5 men were transported to Richmond and installed in the basement quarters beneath Catherine's apartments. The door at the top of the private staircase was fitted with a heavy lock, and Catherine kept the only key on a chain around her neck. The arrangement had begun. For the first weeks, Catherine's demands were relatively benign. She would summon a man to tend the fire, move furniture, or read aloud while she did needlework. She was testing them, watching how they responded, how quickly they obeyed, whether they showed resistance or resentment. They learned absolute obedience was the only way to avoid punishment. Catherine had a system of rewards and punishments both calculated and capricious. A man who pleased her might receive extra food, a warmer blanket, or a few supervised hours in the mansion gardens. A man who displeased her, by moving too slowly, failing to anticipate her needs, or showing any hint of independent thought, would be locked in his room without food, forced to stand in the cold basement for hours, or subjected to other creative torments that left no visible marks but inflicted psychological torture. The other servants in the mansion noticed something strange in the East Wing but didn't understand its full scope. They noticed Catherine spent most of her time in her private apartments, rarely emerging except for official functions. They noticed the 5 basement men were never seen in the main house, seeming to exist in a separate world. They noticed food sent to the East Wing was different and more abundant. Martha, the head cook, voiced concerns first. She had been enslaved in the governor's mansion for over 20 years, serving under 4 governors. Something ain't right in that East Wing, she told her daughter Bess, a housemaid. Mrs. Fairmont, she's got those 5 men locked up down there like prisoners. And the food she wants me to send up, it's like she's feeding guests, not slaves. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, wine from the cellar. What's she doing with them? Bess had noticed other things. Once, carrying linens late at night, she heard voices behind the closed doors, not a mistress giving orders, but something low, intimate, almost conversational. Another time, passing the basement stairs door, she heard what sounded like a man sobbing. Maybe we should tell someone, Bess whispered. Maybe the governor. Martha shook her head firmly. Tell him what? That his wife is acting strange. That she keeps slaves in her private quarters. That ain't illegal, child. She owns those men. She can do what she wants with them. And if we go making accusations without proof, we'll be the ones who suffer. Mrs. Fairmont would have us sold away before we could blink. No, we keep our heads down and our mouths shut. That's how we survive. But Martha couldn't shake the feeling something terrible was happening. She began to watch, listen, and remember. In the basement quarters, the 5 men were learning the arrangement's true nature. It started with Marcus. Catherine summoned him to her sitting room one afternoon in late June, about 6 weeks after their arrival. She wore a silk dressing gown, her hair unpinned and falling around her shoulders. She told Marcus to tend the fire. When he finished and stood to leave, she told him to wait. Come here, she said, her voice soft but commanding. Marcus approached, eyes downcast, heart pounding. He had learned to read Catherine's moods, and something in her voice frightened him. Catherine reached out and touched his face, running fingers along his jaw. Marcus flinched but didn't pull away. He knew any resistance would be punished. You're afraid of me, Catherine said, smiling. Good. You should be. But if you do exactly as I say, I won't hurt you. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, Marcus whispered. What happened next would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. Catherine used him, treated him not as a person but as an object for her gratification. When finished, she sent him back to the basement with a warning: if he ever spoke of what happened, she would have his wife and children sold to the Deep South, and he would never see them again. Marcus stumbled down the stairs, mind reeling, body shaking. He locked himself in his room and wept, great racking sobs he tried to muffle with his pillow so the others wouldn't hear. But they heard anyway. Over the following weeks and months, each man would experience the same. Catherine would summon them one by one, use them for her pleasure, and send them back with threats ensuring their silence. The 5 men existed in a nightmare with no escape. They were locked in the basement at night. During the day, they were at Catherine's constant beck and call, never knowing when summoned, what demanded, how long kept. They were fed well, housed in relative comfort, but they were prisoners subjected to abuses they could not resist or report. They couldn't tell other slaves because Catherine made clear anyone who spoke would be punished, not just the speaker, but his family, friends, anyone he cared about. They couldn't tell Governor Fairmont, who would believe enslaved men accusing the governor's wife. And even if believed, what could be done? Catherine owned them. She had the legal right to do whatever she wanted with her property. They were trapped. Daniel, the youngest and most educated, tried to cope. His literacy became another tool for Catherine to exploit. She would have him read for hours, not for the stories, but to watch him perform, struggle to keep his voice steady while she lounged sipping wine, studying him with cold green eyes. Sometimes she would ask questions about the reading, testing his comprehension. If his answers didn't satisfy her, she would punish him with isolation, locked in his basement room for days with only bread and water. He would sit in darkness and wonder if he was going mad. William, the blacksmith, retreated into himself. Already broken once by his failed escape, he was being broken again in a different way. He moved through days like a ghost, doing what told, feeling nothing, thinking nothing. It was the only way to survive. James, always quiet and careful, tried to make himself invisible. He learned to anticipate Catherine's needs before voiced, to move silently, never meet her eyes, to be unobtrusive. He thought if he could be perfect, avoid displeasing her, maybe she would leave him alone. But Catherine didn't want perfection. She wanted power, and power required someone to dominate. Samuel, the valet, tried to please Catherine, to give her what she wanted before she demanded it, to make himself valuable enough for better treatment. It didn't work. Catherine didn't want a willing participant, she wanted submission, fear, absolute control. Samuel's attempts to please only irritated her, and she punished him more frequently, as if his compliance insulted her authority. Marcus, the carpenter, suffered most visibly. His wife and children on the plantation kept him alive but also tortured him. He knew Catherine used his family as leverage, any resistance would result in their being sold away. He was trapped between love for his family and horror at what he endured, and the conflict tore him apart. The other slaves watched the 5 men deteriorate and whispered among themselves. They didn't know exactly what happened, but they saw the effects. The men grew thin despite good food. Their eyes hollowed, movements turned mechanical. They rarely spoke, even to each other, and when they did, voices were flat, emotionless. Mrs. Dawes, the free black housekeeper, was deeply troubled. She had worked in wealthy households most of her life and had seen many abuses. But something about the East Wing was different. She began keeping a diary in careful script, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She recorded dates, times, observations, when Catherine summoned each man, how long they stayed, what condition they were in when they emerged. She didn't know what she would do with the information but felt compelled to document it, to bear witness to what everyone else ignored. In February 1841, something made the situation more disturbing. A young housemaid named Patience began showing signs of pregnancy. This wasn't unusual, enslaved women were frequently subjected to sexual violence. But when Mrs. Dawes asked Patience who the father was, the girl became hysterical, sobbing and shaking, begging Mrs. Dawes not to ask, not to tell anyone. She made me, Patience finally gasped. Mrs. Fairmont made me go down there. She watched. She told me what to do. Please, please don't tell anyone. They'll sell me south. They'll separate me from my mother. Mrs. Dawes was horrified. She tried for more information, but Patience was too terrified. The girl was convinced if anyone found out, she would be punished, sold away, separated from everyone she loved. Mrs. Dawes faced an impossible dilemma. She was free, but her freedom was precarious. She worked for the governor. If she made accusations against his wife without proof, she would lose her position, reputation, possibly her freedom itself. And if what Patience suggested was true, that Catherine was forcing enslaved women into encounters with the basement men and watching, who would believe it? It was too monstrous, too depraved. People would think Mrs. Dawes was lying, mad, or causing trouble. She decided to say nothing but to watch even more carefully. Over the next year, 2 more housemaids became pregnant under similar circumstances. Both refused to name fathers, exhibited the same terror when questioned, and both had been seen entering the East Wing late at night, emerging hours later disheveled and weeping. Mrs. Dawes added these observations to her diary, along with her growing suspicion. It seemed Catherine wasn't content using the 5 men for her own gratification. She was orchestrating encounters between them and enslaved women, treating human beings like livestock, breeding them for amusement or some twisted psychological need. The 5 men in the basement knew what was happening but were powerless to stop it. When Catherine summoned one and brought a terrified housemaid down, they had no choice but to comply. Refusal meant punishment, not just for them, but for the women blamed for their disobedience. It was depravity beyond anything before. They were being used not just for Catherine's pleasure, but as instruments of her power over others, forced to participate in violating women just as trapped and powerless. Daniel, with some spark of resistance left, tried once to refuse. Catherine brought a young housemaid, no more than 16, to the basement and ordered Daniel to take her into his room. Daniel looked at the girl's terrified face and said, "No." Catherine's expression didn't change. "Very well," she said, and sent the girl away. Then she had Daniel locked in his room for a week with no food, only water. When she finally let him out, she brought the same girl back and repeated her order. This time, Daniel obeyed. He had learned resistance was futile, only resulting in prolonged suffering for everyone. It was better to comply quickly, to try to be as gentle as possible with the women forced into the basement, to whisper apologies that meant nothing but were all he had. The psychological toll on all 5 men was devastating. They were forced to participate in their own degradation and the degradation of others, with no escape, no relief, no hope. They existed in constant fear and shame, knowing what happened was wrong but unable to stop it. Marcus began having nightmares, waking gasping and sweating, haunted by images of his wife and children dragged away in chains. He stopped eating, lost weight, developed a tremor in his hands. James retreated further into silence, speaking only when directly addressed, and then monosyllabically. He moved like a shadow, and other slaves began avoiding him, disturbed by the emptiness in his eyes. William's resignation deepened into near catatonia. He would stand for hours unmoving, staring at nothing, and had to be physically prompted to perform simple tasks. Daniel's suppressed anger began leaking out. He would clench fists until nails drew blood, mutter under his breath, sometimes look at Catherine with such hatred even she noticed and punished him for insolence. Samuel developed a nervous habit of picking at his skin, creating small wounds on his arms and hands that never healed because he couldn't stop worrying at them. The other slaves noticed these changes and whispered, something terrible was happening in the East Wing, but no one knew what to do. And so they did nothing. Governor Fairmont, meanwhile, was oblivious, consumed with his political career, legislative battles, party politics, and constant maneuvering to maintain power. He rarely saw his wife except at official functions, where she was perfectly composed, charming, the ideal political spouse. He had long stopped visiting Catherine's bedroom. Their marriage was one of convenience and appearance. Thomas had his career in business, Catherine had whatever she did in the East Wing. He didn't ask, and she didn't tell. In spring 1842, Catherine announced she was pregnant. Thomas was overjoyed. After 11 years, he had given up hope of an heir. He threw a celebration dinner, invited Richmond's elite, toasted his wife's health with imported French champagne. He became attentive, asking after her health, ensuring she had everything needed. Catherine accepted with gracious smiles and appropriate modesty. She glowed with health and satisfaction, and Richmond society congratulated her. Finally, the governor would have an heir. Finally, Catherine had fulfilled her primary duty. But the servants knew something the governor didn't. Catherine had not shared her husband's bed in over a year. Joseph, the governor's elderly valet, had mentioned this to Mrs. Dawes months earlier. The governor sleeps in his own chambers, has done for more than a year now. Says his wife needs her rest, that she's delicate. But if they ain't sharing a bed, how is she pregnant? Mrs. Dawes had no answer but suspicions. She had seen Catherine summon Marcus with increasing frequency over the past year. She had seen Catherine look at Marcus with a possessive intensity, and she remembered Marcus was tall and strong with dark hair and blue eyes, features that could be passed off as inherited from Fairmont or Henley families. Catherine's pregnancy progressed normally. She continued spending most time in the East Wing, claiming she needed rest and quiet. She continued summoning the 5 men, though less frequently as pregnancy advanced, and seemed happier than in years, as if pregnancy had given her something desperately sought. In November 1842, Catherine gave birth to a son. The delivery was smooth, attended by Richmond's finest physician and 2 midwives. The baby was healthy with a lusty cry and strong grip. Named Thomas Fairmont Jr., the governor was beside himself with pride. Richmond society celebrated with parties, gifts, and visits. Newspapers printed announcements. The baby was christened at St. John's Episcopal Church before Virginia's political elite. Thomas Fairmont had an heir, the Fairmont legacy was secure. But Mrs. Dawes, seeing the baby when the wet nurse brought him to the kitchen, noticed something that chilled her blood. The baby had a distinctive birthmark on his left shoulder, a dark, crescent-shaped mark the size of a thumbprint. She had seen that exact birthmark before on Marcus's left shoulder, visible when he rolled up sleeves to carry firewood. Mrs. Dawes said nothing. What could she say? That the governor's son might be an enslaved man's child. It was unthinkable, dangerous, a secret that could get everyone in the household killed. But she wrote it in her diary, dated and detailed, and hid the book away. In the basement, Marcus knew the truth. Catherine told him with cruel satisfaction the child was his. She had used him to produce the heir she couldn't with her husband. Now she had proof of her power, a child who would inherit the Fairmont fortune and name, who carried Marcus's blood but would never know his true father. Marcus was devastated. He had a son, but that son would grow up white, as the governor's heir, a slave owner. His son would never know him, never know the truth. And Marcus would watch from a distance, unable to claim his child, protect him, do anything but serve the woman who stole his child and life. This knowledge broke something fundamental in Marcus. He had endured abuse, captivity, forced encounters, clinging to hope for his wife and children on the plantation. But now he had a son who would never be his, and the weight of that loss was unbearable. He deteriorated rapidly. He stopped eating almost entirely, became gaunt and hollow-eyed, hands shaking constantly. He would stand in his room and weep for hours in great silent sobs. The other 4 men watched with alarm but didn't know how to help. They were all trapped in the same nightmare. Catherine noticed Marcus's decline but didn't care. She had what she wanted, a son, an heir, proof of her power. Marcus had served his purpose. If he fell apart, she could replace him. The following years held a strange, tense normalcy. Catherine continued her arrangement. The 5 men remained in the basement, locked at night, summoned by day. More housemaids became pregnant mysteriously. Young Thomas grew from infant to toddler, healthy and happy, doted on by his father and household. Governor Fairmont's term ended in 1842, but he remained influential, advising successors and managing business. He and Catherine continued living in the governor's mansion as a courtesy from the new governor, a political ally. To the outside world, the Fairmonts were successful, respectable. Thomas was a respected elder statesman, Catherine a devoted mother and charitable society matron, young Thomas Jr. Richmond Society's pride. But inside the East Wing, the nightmare continued. In 1845, Daniel made a decision with catastrophic consequences. He couldn't endure any more. He had watched Marcus deteriorate, seen terror in the women's eyes, felt his own humanity stripped away piece by piece. He had to do something, try to get help, even risking everything. He smuggled a letter out of the mansion. How, no one ever knew. Perhaps he bribed a delivery boy with a coin somehow acquired, slipped it into a merchant's cart, passed it to a sympathetic free black person in the market during rare supervised outside occasions. However done, a letter in Daniel's careful handwriting reached the offices of the Richmond Enquirer, the city's most prominent newspaper. The letter was carefully worded. Daniel didn't name Catherine or the governor's mansion specifically but described in harrowing detail being held captive by a wealthy white woman who used enslaved men for her purposes, orchestrated forced encounters as if breeding livestock, kept them locked in basement rooms, threatened them with being sold south if they spoke. He described psychological torture, constant fear, complete powerlessness, watching others suffer unable to help, the slow destruction of his humanity. He ended with a plea. I am writing this knowing it may cost me my life, but I cannot remain silent any longer. Someone must know what is happening. Someone must bear witness. If you are reading this, please know that we existed, that we suffered, that we were human beings who deserved better than what we received. Thomas Ritchie, editor of the Richmond Enquirer, read the letter with growing horror. He was a respected journalist who built his career on truth. But he also understood Virginia society in 1845. Slavery was legal, enshrined in law and custom. Enslaved people had no legal rights, no recourse, their testimony was inadmissible in court, their experiences not considered worthy of public concern. If he published this, what would happen? Would anyone believe it? Would it make a difference? Or would it cause a scandal destroying the newspaper's reputation and put the writer in greater danger? Ritchie wrestled for days. He showed the letter to trusted colleagues, they debated. Some argued for publication, that truth needed telling regardless of consequences. Others argued it would be futile and dangerous, accomplishing nothing except risking the writer and other enslaved people. In the end, Ritchie made a decision he would regret forever. He decided not to publish but didn't destroy it. He locked it in his desk drawer, where it remained for decades, evidence too dangerous to reveal but too important to discard. Daniel's attempt had consequences he couldn't anticipate. Catherine discovered the letter. How she found out is unknown. Perhaps someone at the newspaper mentioned it to a political contact, word filtering back to Fairmont circles. Perhaps an enslaved person saw Daniel writing and reported it, hoping for favor or to avoid punishment. Perhaps Catherine noticed a change in Daniel's demeanor, a hint of defiance or hope, and investigated. However she learned, her reaction was explosive. She summoned Daniel and confronted him. She didn't have the letter but knew he had written something, tried to send it outside, attempted to expose her. Catherine flew into a rage unlike anything the household had witnessed. She screamed at Daniel, called him ungrateful and treacherous, accused him of betrayal after all she had done. Other servants heard her voice throughout the mansion, shrill and furious, and cowered in terror. Daniel stood and took the abuse in silence. He had known this might happen, accepted the risk when he wrote. He had hoped the letter would reach someone who could help. But even if not, at least he had tried. At least he had refused to remain silent. When Catherine exhausted herself screaming, she made a decision. Daniel had to be removed immediately and permanently. He was too dangerous, too defiant, too likely to try again. She summoned 2 men from the Fairmont plantation, overseers known for brutality and absolute loyalty. They arrived in Richmond the next day, and that night they took Daniel away. The official story: Daniel had run away, caught by slave catchers in Petersburg and sold to an Alabama plantation. But the other 4 basement men knew the truth, or suspected it. They heard Daniel dragged from his room in the middle of the night, heard muffled cries, heard a wagon leaving mansion grounds. They never saw Daniel again. He disappeared, erased from household records as if never existing. Daniel's disappearance profoundly affected the remaining 4. Any hope, any thought of resistance or escape, died with his removal. They understood Catherine's power was absolute. There was no help coming, no way out. They could only endure and try to survive. Marcus, already deteriorating, grew worse. He stopped speaking entirely, even when addressed. He moved like an automaton, performing tasks with mechanical precision but showing no awareness or emotion. His eyes were empty, face blank, a hollowed shell. James, William, and Samuel watched Marcus's decline with dread. They saw themselves in him, saw their own future if they remained. But what could they do? They were locked in at night, watched by day, threatened with family sold if they disobeyed. They were trapped. Catherine seemed energized by Daniel's removal. She had eliminated a threat, reasserted control, proven she could make people disappear if they challenged her. She became more demanding, capricious, creative in cruelties. She would summon men at odd hours, keep them entire nights, send them back exhausted and hollow-eyed. She began drinking more heavily, wine with dinner, brandy afternoon, whiskey late at night. Her hands shook, temper flared at small provocations, mood swings became extreme. Governor Fairmont, largely oblivious, finally began noticing something wrong. Catherine was no longer the composed, charming asset to his career. She was erratic, volatile, often drunk. She neglected social obligations, missed charity events, snapped at guests. Thomas suggested she see a doctor, take a rest cure, visit relatives in Charlottesville. Catherine refused violently, screaming she was fine, needed privacy, everyone should leave her alone. Thomas, uncomfortable with her intensity and relieved to avoid her, backed off. He spent more time at the plantation, in political meetings, anywhere but the mansion. He told himself Catherine was going through a difficult phase, would recover, best to give her space. But Catherine's mental state deteriorated. She became paranoid, convinced servants plotted against her, people talked about her, everyone tried to undermine her authority. She would interrogate staff about imagined infractions, accuse them of theft, laziness, insubordination, punish for offenses existing only in her mind. The mansion atmosphere became oppressive, fearful. Servants walked on eggshells. Several begged Governor Fairmont to intervene, but Thomas refused. Catherine's household management was her domain, he wouldn't interfere. In summer 1847, Catherine made a fatal decision. She wanted another child. She was 36, young Thomas was 5. She had successfully passed off one enslaved man's child as her husband's heir. Perhaps in her deteriorating state, she believed she could again. Or perhaps she wanted to recreate the one time she felt powerful and successful, achieving what everyone said was impossible. She stopped drinking, ate better, took walks, attended church, smiled at gatherings, played devoted wife and mother. To the outside, Catherine seemed recovered. But in the East Wing, she intensified demands on the 4 remaining men. She summoned Marcus repeatedly, trying to recreate circumstances leading to Thomas Jr.'s conception. But Marcus was too broken, barely functional, barely responsive. Catherine grew frustrated, then angry. She berated Marcus for weakness, uselessness, failure to give her what she wanted. She punished him by locking him in his room for days, withholding food, subjecting him to verbal abuse as cruel as physical torture. In October 1847, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't endure any more. He couldn't live with what he had been forced to do, the knowledge his son grew up in the same house but would never know him. He couldn't live with constant fear, pain, degradation. One night while others slept, Marcus took a rope from basement storage. He tied it to a ceiling beam in his room, fashioned a noose, stood on a chair, and stepped off. The other servants found him in the morning when he didn't respond to the bell. He hung from the beam, body still and cold, face peaceful for the first time in years. No note, no explanation, just a body swinging gently in dim basement light. James, William, and Samuel stood in the doorway and stared. They understood. Marcus had found the only escape available. He chose death over continued suffering, and none could blame him. Catherine's reaction was not grief or remorse but fury. She raged Marcus was weak, selfish, had ruined everything. She ordered his body removed immediately, buried in the slave cemetery without ceremony or marker. She demanded another man brought from the plantation to replace him, as if Marcus were a broken tool swapped out. But Governor Fairmont, returning to Richmond for a political dinner and informed of the suicide, finally began asking questions. Why was Marcus in the basement? Why separate rooms down there? Why did his wife keep these men isolated? What exactly was happening? Thomas had ignored whispers and rumors for years, convinced whatever Catherine did was her business. But a man had killed himself in the governor's mansion basement, that couldn't be ignored. It was a scandal waiting to happen, and his political instincts overcame willful blindness. He investigated quietly, discreetly. He spoke to Joseph, his valet, who told of locked doors and strange hours. He spoke to Martha, the cook, who told of unusual food orders and how Catherine treated the 5 men differently. Finally, he spoke to Mrs. Dawes, who had waited years for someone to ask right questions. Mrs. Dawes showed Thomas her diary. She walked him through years of observations, dated entries, detailed accounts. She told of pregnancies, locked doors, terror in housemaids' eyes. She told of Daniel's disappearance and the newspaper letter. She told of Marcus's deterioration and the birthmark on young Thomas Jr.'s shoulder. Thomas read with growing horror. He was not particularly moral by modern standards. He owned over 100 slaves, built wealth on their labor. But even he was shocked by his wife's actions, sexual abuse, forced breeding, psychological torture, the possibility his son was an enslaved man's child. It was beyond anything imagined. But Thomas's primary concern was not suffering but potential scandal. If word got out about Catherine's arrangement, if truth about young Thomas Jr.'s parentage became known, it would destroy the Fairmont name forever. Thomas would be a laughingstock, political career over, business interests suffering, family reputation ruined. He had to contain the situation immediately, completely. On November 12, 1847, Thomas confronted Catherine in the East Wing. No one knows exactly what was said. Servants heard shouting, crashing glass, Catherine's voice rising to a shriek. They heard Thomas's voice cold and furious, demanding answers. They heard Catherine screaming she had done nothing wrong, slaves were hers to do with as pleased, he had no right to judge, she had given him an heir when he couldn't give her one. Then, suddenly, silence. Servants waited in the hallway, afraid to enter. Mrs. Dawes finally knocked. No answer. She opened slowly. Catherine Fairmont lay on the sitting room floor, face purple, eyes bulging, hands clawed at her throat. She was dead. Governor Fairmont stood over her, face ashen, hands shaking. She collapsed, he said hoarsely. She was screaming and then she just collapsed. Her heart, I think, or apoplexy. She just fell. Mrs. Dawes looked at Catherine's body, broken glass, overturned furniture. She looked at Thomas's hands, bearing no violence marks, and Catherine's throat, showing no strangulation signs. It was possible Catherine died of apoplexy brought by extreme emotion. Also possible Thomas helped her along, though no evidence. I'll send for the doctor, Mrs. Dawes said quietly. The doctor arrived within the hour, a discreet man serving Virginia's elite for decades, understanding what was expected. He examined Catherine's body briefly and declared cause of death apoplexy brought on by nervous excitement. A convenient diagnosis, vague enough to be unverifiable, respectable enough to avoid scandal, plausible enough none would question. Catherine was buried 3 days later in Hollywood Cemetery in the Henley family plot. The funeral was well attended. Newspapers printed glowing obituaries praising charity work and family devotion. No one mentioned the East Wing, the 5 men, or secrets buried with her. But Thomas knew danger wasn't over. 3 enslaved men still knew everything. There was Mrs. Dawes and her diary. Housemaids forced into basement rooms. The letter in Thomas Ritchie's desk. Young Thomas Jr. with his telltale birthmark. Thomas acted swiftly, ruthlessly to eliminate every trace. The 3 remaining basement men, James, William, Samuel, were sold to a slave trader within a week. The trader specialized in the Deep South market. The 3 were transported to Louisiana, disappearing into the vast plantation system. Thomas ensured they were sold to different owners in different parishes, never seeing each other again, never telling their story together. Housemaids forced into the basement were also sold, scattered across Virginia and the Carolinas, separated from families and communities, silenced by distance and fear. Mrs. Dawes was offered a generous sum, more money than ever seen, and a recommendation letter to a Philadelphia family. The unspoken message was clear: take money, leave Virginia, never speak of what's seen. Mrs. Dawes, practical and aware of her precarious position, accepted. She took her diary, hidden in her trunk, and left Richmond on a cold December morning. She lived in Philadelphia the rest of her life, never speaking publicly of what witnessed. Thomas then did something extraordinary. He called an emergency meeting of Virginia General Assembly leadership. Men worked with for years, owed him favors, understood Virginia's political class reputation at stake. He told everything, not from guilt or wanting confession, but needing their help to bury scandal completely. Legislators were shocked, disgusted, terrified. If this became public, it would be a disaster, not just for Fairmonts, but all. It would fuel Northern abolitionist propaganda, damage Virginia's reputation, raise uncomfortable questions about wealthy and powerful private quarters, potentially inspire enslaved resistance or rebellion. They decided the East Wing would be closed, renovated, repurposed. All records related to enslaved people who worked there would be lost in a convenient filing error. Household staff would be replaced entirely with new servants knowing nothing. Everyone attending would sign a confidentiality agreement binding them to silence for 100 years. The agreement was signed December 3, 1847, witnessed by a notary, locked in state archives with instructions not to open until December 3, 1947. But Thomas wasn't finished. He wanted every physical trace eliminated. On the night of December 15, 1847, a fire broke out in the East Wing. It started in Catherine's former sitting room, spread rapidly, consuming the entire wing before firefighters contained it. The official report blamed faulty chimney construction, but servants whispered Thomas set it himself, determined to destroy every trace. The fire destroyed Catherine's sitting room, bedroom, library, and private staircase to basement quarters. Heat was so intense it cracked the foundation, caused part of the basement to collapse. When ruins cleared, Thomas ordered basement quarters filled with brick and mortar, sealed as if never existing. The East Wing was rebuilt in 1848 with a completely different layout. New rooms bore no resemblance to Catherine's apartments, as if that mansion section erased from history. Thomas Ritchie kept Daniel's letter in his desk until his death in 1854. His son found it going through papers and, after reading, made the same decision: too dangerous to publish, too important to destroy. The letter passed through 3 Ritchie family generations before being donated anonymously to the Virginia Historical Society in 1921, filed unread in a box of miscellaneous correspondence. Mrs. Dawes lived in Philadelphia until her death in 1869. Her diary was found among possessions by her granddaughter, horrified by contents but recognizing historical importance. She donated it anonymously to the Library of Congress in 1903, where it sat uncatalogued, unexamined for decades. Thomas Fairmont lived until 1856, dying of pneumonia at 60. He took secrets to the grave. Obituaries praised him as a statesman and Virginia society pillar. His son Thomas Jr. grew up a Confederate officer, dying at Gettysburg in 1863 at 20. He never knew truth of his parentage, the crescent-shaped birthmark on his left shoulder noted in military medical records as a distinguishing mark. The three men sold to Louisiana, James, William, Samuel, left no records of later lives. They disappeared into slavery's anonymity, names appearing in ledgers and bills of sale, never in documents recording voices, experiences, or fates. If they survived until 1865 emancipation, there is no record. If they tried returning to Virginia to tell their story, no one documented it. They vanished from history as if never existing. Marcus was buried in the slave cemetery behind Fairmont Plantation in Hanover County. The cemetery was abandoned after the Civil War, by the 1920s, swallowed by forest. In 1968, a developer clearing land for a housing subdivision discovered the cemetery and was required to relocate remains. Marcus's grave was identified by a crude wooden marker somehow surviving with his name and, 1847, carved. His remains were moved to a public cemetery under a small stone, Marcus D. 1847. Daniel's fate remains unknown. No record of sale to Alabama, arrival at any Deep South plantation, what happened after taken from the mansion. He simply disappeared. His disappearance remains one of many mysteries. The truth about Catherine Fairmont remained hidden over a century. The confidentiality agreement kept legislators silent until 1947, by then, most were dead. The diary and letter sat unread, uncatalogued. Physical evidence destroyed. Witnesses scattered or silenced. A perfect cover-up might have remained hidden forever but for coincidences. In 1952, University of Virginia graduate student Robert Hayes researched Virginia political history for his dissertation. He spent weeks in the Library of Congress manuscript collection going through boxes. He almost missed Mrs. Dawes's diary, in a box labeled Miscellaneous Household Records 19th Century, never properly catalogued. But Hayes was thorough. When he started reading, he thought it fiction, some Gothic novel. But as he read further, he realized it was too detailed, specific, grounded in verifiable facts to be fiction. Mrs. Dawes recorded dates, names, events cross-referenced with other historical documents. Hayes brought the diary to his advisor, Professor Margaret Chen, stunned by contents. Together, they investigated, cross-referencing with other records. They found sealed General Assembly records in Virginia State Archives, opened in 1947 per confidentiality agreement. Records confirmed an emergency meeting December 1847, a confidentiality agreement signed, subject, a matter of extreme delicacy involving the former governor's household. They found Daniel's letter in Virginia Historical Society archives, filed in miscellaneous correspondence, dated 1845, describing experiences matching Mrs. Dawes's diary. They found property records showing enslaved people sold from Fairmont household late 1847, 5 men, 3 women, all sold within 2 weeks of Catherine's death. They found the fire report December 1847, noting fire started in East Wing, unusually intense, almost as if deliberately set. They found Catherine's death certificate listing apoplexy. They found household ledger showing 5 men transferred from Fairmont Plantation to Mansion May 1840, assigned exclusively to East Wing. Everything matched. Every detail in Mrs. Dawes's diary corroborated. The scandal was real. Hayes wrote his dissertation on the subject, published as a book in 1955, The Hidden Quarters, Sexual Exploitation and Power in Antebellum Virginia. It caused a minor academic stir. Some historians praised uncovering an important, disturbing American history chapter, others criticized sensationalism or conclusions beyond evidence. The Fairmont family, by then scattered, no longer prominent, didn't respond. Most probably didn't know, it had been buried so thoroughly even family forgot. But Hayes's book opened doors for further research. Other historians investigated similar cases, looking for evidence of enslaved men's sexual exploitation by white women. They discovered while rare, such cases weren't unique. Other documented instances existed in private letters, diaries of wealthy white women using power over enslaved men in disturbing ways. Slavery's power dynamics created abuse opportunities far beyond well-documented white men's sexual violence against enslaved women. White women, though constrained by patriarchy, still held absolute power over enslaved people. Some used that power in ways hidden, denied, erased from official history. In 1967, historian Dr. Patricia Williams published a comprehensive study, Hidden Abuses, Gender, Power, and Sexual Exploitation in the Antebellum South. The book examined dozens of cases similar to Catherine Fairmont's from private letters, diaries, court records, oral histories from enslaved descendants. Williams argued enslaved men's sexual exploitation by white women was far more common than previously believed but systematically erased from historical memory because it contradicted prevailing narratives about slavery and gender. Catherine Fairmont's scandal was exceptional not because unique, but because documented. Most such cases left no trace, protected by social pressure, political power, and enslaved people's legal invisibility, testimony inadmissible, experiences unworthy of record. Today, the governor's mansion in Richmond still stands, renovated and expanded many times since 1847. It serves as Virginia governor's official residence, open for public tours. Tourists walk elegant rooms, admire period furniture, portraits of Virginia governors. No plaque mentions Catherine Fairmont. No marker indicates where the East Wing stood. No acknowledgement of 5 men held captive in the basement. But if you know where to look, traces remain. In the basement, brick wall sections slightly different color, where separate quarters were filled, sealed. In Virginia State Archives, gaps in household records for Governor's Mansion 1840 to 1847, pages removed or lost. In slave cemetery records for Hanover County, a notation for Marcus with cause of death, self-murder, a term appearing nowhere else in the ledger. Catherine Fairmont's story raises questions with no easy answers. How many other women in power exploited those beneath in ways never recorded? How many enslaved people suffered abuses so taboo, unthinkable even other slaves couldn't speak? How many secrets buried under official silence, protected by confidentiality agreements and convenient fires? Perhaps most disturbingly, if Mrs. Dawes hadn't kept her diary, if Daniel hadn't written his letter, if Robert Hayes hadn't stumbled across documents by chance, would we ever have known this happened? The historical record is full of silences, gaps where uncomfortable truths should be. Catherine Fairmont's scandal survived only because a few refused to let it disappear completely, even when doing so put them at risk. Mrs. Dawes documented what she saw, though speaking out could cost everything. Daniel wrote his letter, though it might cost his life. Thomas Ritchie kept the letter, though publishing could destroy his newspaper. Robert Hayes pursued truth, though colleagues warned the subject too controversial, disturbing, likely to damage his career. They preserved truth because they believed what happened in the governor's mansion East Wing mattered. Marcus's, James's, Williams, Daniel's, Samuel's suffering mattered. Patience's and other housemaids' terror mattered. They believed history should record not just grand political events and powerful lives, but hidden abuses, secret cruelties, suffering of those without voice.